Welcome. I'm Scott Nelson, the Director of Agronomy for the ISA Center for Farming Innovation. And today we're going to talk about insights for increased profit. And this is a 4R series brought to you by Mosaic Environmental Tillage Systems and the Fertilizer Institute. And what we have here is a series of videos that we're going to go over with you. And the big idea is how can we improve your profitability. So this is some of the talks that we'll be going through: practical 4R tips for 2021, economics of 4R stewardship, new tools to manage inputs. They're all interesting, but this is a key one that you want to look at: edge of field practices to reduce nutrient losses. In my talk today, I'm going to talk to you about some practical tips for 2021. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about nitrogen timing, new results on nitrification inhibitors, comment on nitrogen rates, P&K applications, lime, and we'll end up with a little bit of talk about cover crop management. First thing I want to talk to you about is time of fertilizer application. We're all thinking about fall, or we're starting to, and wanted to comment about the time of nitrogen application with you. So in an anhydrous situation, clay and loamy soils, for fall applied nitrogen, you're about 80 to 90% as efficient as you are with spring applied. So keep that in mind as you make your planning this coming fall. If you're on sandier soils, fall applied can be much less. You're down to, you can be down as low as 40 to 60% as efficient on sandy soils. So this is one comment we have here, is that a lot of farmers tell me they can't do all spring applied on their nitrogen and just due to logistics and those issues. So what we suggest is, if you can't apply all of your N in the spring, well, consider at least 25% of that, and maybe put that on your most variable acres, your most poorly drained soils, or your fields with sand lenses and things. And that'll improve your overall nitrogen efficiency a great deal. So time of application really matters to your profitability, and that's something you kind of know already, but I wanted to bring it to your attention as a reminder. As we think about fall applied anhydrous ammonia, I wanted to comment: every year in Iowa we see instances of damaged stands due to anhydrous ammonia, and it doesn't matter if it's fall applied or spring applied. We can see damaged seedlings from anhydrous burn. And what causes that is the ammonia is usually placed too shallow. We have a lot of high-speed discs that apply, or high-speed applicators that apply anhydrous at a very fast rate, but sometimes we compromise and we get too shallow in our injection bands. So the best way to prevent this is to inject your ammonia 6 to 8 inches deep. That takes more time, but it takes a lot more time to replant a crop. And sometimes, just keep in mind, sometimes you're not injecting as deep as you think, and that's something that you want to monitor and think about to avoid anhydrous burn. There's no fix for it once you burn the crop up. I want to switch your attention to a little bit about, there's been some newer work done on nitrification inhibitors, and these prevent the conversion of ammonia to nitrate, which is vulnerable to nitrogen loss. And what we've seen here in these newer studies, some of the brand names are Centuro, Instinct, N-Serve. But what these do is these reduce nitrogen fertilizer loss to the environment by about 17%. That's based on a newer study published in 2015. And they got that data they took hundreds of university trials and put them all together, and they did an analysis to see exactly what's going on with nitrification inhibitors. In this same study, they found that you can increase corn yield from 3 to 17%. And then they also concluded that inhibitors work best for late fall applications. Inhibitors, if you're going to apply your ammonia in September when the soil is warm, they're going to be a lot less effective than if you're applying it at 50 degrees and cooling. Just to show you a picture from this study of what they're doing here, what I have here on the y-axis is relative percent nitrogen leaching. And then this is all of the studies that they compiled together. And what I want you to notice is that these inhibitors were reducing nitrate leaching by 50% to, in some cases they increased it, and we don't quite understand why that is, but no management practice wins every time. But the average was about 16% reduction in nitrate leaching in the groundwater. which means a cleaner environment for you to enjoy, as well as reduced nutrient loss, which contributes to your profitability if you can maintain that nitrogen. Here's an example of yield data. This is zero yield advantage with an inhibitor, and you can see some instances where we lost. And this is a relative percent yield loss for corn, and then this is all the studies that they compiled. And you can see that in general there's a yield advantage for the use of inhibitors, and that turns out to be about 7 bushels according to this most recent publication. So think about inhibitors this coming fall to increase your profit. I want to talk a little bit about nitrogen rate with you. And we at the Center for Farming Innovation, we do a lot of these kind of trials, nitrogen rate, where we go from 80 pounds to 200 pounds in this case, in this field, or sometimes if it's corn on corn, we'll go to a higher rate. We replicate them across the landscape, and these strips are about 1 round of a harvester. And so we set up all of these trials. We have about 20 of them from on-farm research here in Iowa. And I want to go over some kind of key learnings that we have from these as they relate to nitrogen management. So this is the most complicated graph I'm going to show you. So let me take a minute to explain it to you. What I have here on the x-axis is spring rainfall. And then here I have the nitrogen optimum rate. So if I go back to this graph, say 170 pounds was the optimum rate in this field that we determined. So what we did is we plotted what the optimum nitrogen rate was as a function of spring rainfall. And what I want you to notice is that corn after soybeans, it's a pretty flat rate in that response to, as it gets wetter, you can see that the nitrogen optimum kind of goes up a little bit. But look at for corn on corn. As the spring gets wetter, there's a tremendous jump in the need for corn in a wet spring. This is spring rainfall in inches, and this is May to June rainfall. And again, what I want you to see is that as we get into a wetter summer, the nitrogen response, the optimum nitrogen response matters a little bit with soybeans, but it manages a tremendous amount in corn on corn. And that's very significant because the optimum N rate, it can be very weather dependent. And what that means for you is this thing called terminology alert, adaptive management. And what that means is in a system where you're corn on corn, what you might consider doing, according to our studies, is apply a base rate of nitrogen pre-plant, a lower rate, and then side dress according to what the weather's going to look like. If it's a really wet spring, you may increase your rates in a corn on corn situation, or you may, if the forecast is for drier weather, you may peel back that nitrogen. That's called adaptive management. And what we're seeing in our results is that that's a lot more important in corn on corn than corn on soybeans. Last comment about nitrogen rates is we think that this corn nitrogen rate calculator is pretty good for Iowa. It's a good place to start. Our results, sometimes we show that we need about 30% or 30 pounds more nitrogen than the corn nitrogen rate calculator is showing. But that's because some of our trials were less efficient in that we're applying in the fall, and we can see differences that way. So for nitrogen rates, use the nitrogen rate calculator and consider adaptive management for your corn falling corn. I want to switch a little bit and talk about potassium and phosphorus applications. We get a lot of soil tests for fields in our research program, and this is one example of a field where we grid sample for potassium concentration in the soil. And you can see in this map that this area in dark red is pretty low in potassium, less than 120 parts per million. Our K-test was about 120 to 150 here, and then we had an area of a very high potassium soil test. And that's common. You see that in your fields too. What I want to show you though is in this field, this zone that was the lowest potassium is also the highest yielding. And this yield levels go from 220 to 250. The inherent capacity of this soil is more productive. It's higher yielding, so we're mining more potassium from it. This is a medium yield area, 180 to 220. This area that was highest potassium actually was the lowest yielding area because the crop's not removing that potassium. So what we say is this is a very critical point to make, is that if we're just applying by crop removal rate on the average of the field, we're underfeeding significant parts of the field and we're overfeeding other parts of the field. And that's very important from your profitability. Now, a lot of guys, there's software now where they take yield monitor data and they calculate potassium removal, and then they just apply what the removal rate is for that field. And now you can see that would be a mistake in this situation because we're already at a very low level and we're underfeeding this crop. So that's probably the worst thing you can do in a field like this. So if we only replace what's applied to this field, then there is significant under and over fertilizing. And this is why soil testing is so profitable. We know we're in a tight situation with commodity prices, but this is one area that you don't want to cut, is your soil testing. Getting good grid samples is ideal, and believe me, we've looked at all kinds of different ways for sampling soil, zone sampling, grid sampling, and all that, and bulk sampling, composite sampling. We've done all of that, and our conclusion is really grid sampling to 2.5 acre or 1 1/4 acre grids is really the best thing you can do and shows you the highest profitability. Here's an example, another example from a field we have in Iowa, and here's the yield level in bushels per acre. And say we just wanted to fertilize this field by crop removal or fertilize by the average. So the average would be 212 bushels per acre in this field. If you use the mean yield, you're going to fertilize about 27% of the field right. If you use the mean yield, you're going to under-fertilize about 46% of the field, or 27.5% you'll be overfeeding. This is why soil testing is just so important. Grid sampling is so important. And you know that, but it's one area that seems to get neglected. And we've seen results of 5-to-1 to 20-to-1 results ROI for soil testing. Grid sampling has a high return on investment. Want to talk a little bit about lime just a minute here, and this is some results from Iowa State University, and I pulled it from one of their papers. And what they show here is this is two fields with one is soybeans and one is corn, of very low soil pH. And what we're seeing in Iowa is that due to commodity prices, guys are neglecting their lime, and they're starting to get lower and lower pHs in their soils. And these fields were about 5 to 5.5 pH, and we can get that on some of our timber soils if we neglect them enough. This is the yield response for soybeans according to the effective calcium carbonate rate or lime rate. And they have different types of lime in here. I just want you to ignore those, but look at the response line here. In a low pH soil, we're going from 52 to about almost 56. So we're seeing about a 4 to 6 bushel yield advantage in soybeans just due to liming. If you look at corn, it's a much more extreme. Look at from 160 to, and I point out 3 because that's about all that we would recommend you apply at any one time, is about 3 tons per acre. But you can see there's almost a 30 bushel response in corn to lime rate. So commodity prices are tough and inputs are tough, but this is an area that you really got to pay attention to, especially if your fields are degrading and if you're on timber soils and you have lower soil health due to your liming. Here's another couple of studies, again in low pH soils, and again this is corn. This is some newer studies. They were going from about 208 bushels to almost 230 at a 3 ton rate of lime. So again, another 20 bushel response in corn. And in this study, the response in soybeans was about 6 or 7 bushels again. Don't forget lime in your 2021 season. This is results from 14 replicated trials on soybeans or on corn and soybeans, and they just combine them as a relative response. And this is low pH and timber soils or non-calcareous soils in Iowa. And what I want you to see is that the yield response is greater than if it's compared to fields where we have high pH subsoil like we have in the western part of the state where we have calcareous soils. I want you to see that the subsoil matters a lot, in that parts of the state where we don't have calcareous subsoil are going to respond more to lime than areas that don't. And you kind of know that, but that's another way to gauge your lime expenses and whether you want a lime or not. Think about your soil pH in the subsoil. Is it calcareous or not? Lime RX is don't forget about lime, soil test, and if you can't afford to bring a field up to its optimum, apply some lime to prevent erosion of that soil test. So applying anything is going to do you some good to prevent that loss. Grid sample and variable rate with it. Don't apply more than 2 to 3 tons of effective calcium carbonate equivalent at any single time. And one other thing to think about is that too high of N rates can increase your lime costs. And a lot of times we think about nitrogen fertilizer as cheap insurance. Well, it's really not, because too high of nitrogen rates can erode your soil test pH as well. I want to switch a little bit to talk about cover crop management. And they're very important to the state, and I want to talk about some 4R principles in managing cover crops. The reason cover crops are so important to the state is they can reduce nitrate leaching from 30 to 50%, giving us cleaner tile water for our lakes and streams, and also the Mississippi River basin, helping keeping that clean. Here's an example of one of our cooperators. He's planting his soybeans green into rye. I want to talk about a study related to cover crops. This is a recently published study where they took a long-term cover cropping system where they had 7 years of cover crops year after year after year, and they rotated corn and soybean. And what they found, they measured plant available water in that rotation, and what they found was there was a 22% increase in plant available water from using cover crops. And as we think about this dry summer that we have, think about how much more efficient your crops would be if they had 22% more water. Here's an example from this study. This is day of the year, and I picked 2012 because it was a dry year, kind of like what we're having right now. And this is the volumetric water content. And what I want you to see over time is look how cover crops have more plant available water compared to the no cover crop comparison. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about now how do we manage cover crops, especially corn following cover crops. This is a study, this is 2 studies that were published, and this is nitrate in the soil. And what I want you to see is here, this is the no cover crop comparison, and then this is with cover crop. And what I want you to see in both of these studies is that cover crops significantly reduce the amount of free nitrate in the soil profile. And that's a good thing. That's what we want cover crops to do. But there's a problem here in that this deficit of nitrate can affect corn yield during its early yield formation stages. And so as a way of managing cover crops and managing corn following cover crops, we did a study here where we compared different nitrogen form and placement in corn following cover crops. This farmer's standard practice was to apply ammonia or manure in the fall, and then plant cover crops, and then he side dresses anhydrous about the V6 stage. And you can see what we thought was that early nitrogen immobilization based on this going on here. What we thought is that an application of urea or AMS early in the season would help us overcome this early yellowing, which may be affecting yield formation. And you can see the differences there. And you can see this had a urea and AMS spread early or right after planting, and then this is his standard practice. We'll know more coming this summer or coming this fall about yield effects. Some cover crop specialists will tell us that that you really need 40 to 50% of your total nitrogen as nitrate form at or soon after planting. We're still testing that. That seems extreme, but certainly what we do need is we need nitrate to overcome that immobilization that the rye causes in the early yield formation stages. You can do this by culture injecting UAN pre-plant or early side dress, and by early side dress I mean V3 stage. You can do ammonia pre-plant followed by starter, which a lot of guys do, but we don't think that the starter rates can get high enough in some cases to really overcome that immobilization. Or you can do like we did in this picture, where we broadcast AMS with urea soon after planting. Nitrogen form and placement matters a lot in cover crop situations, especially corn following cover crops. Just want to give you a beauty shot here. This is a very nice system we have in Iowa and is strip till with cover crops. And this is for guys on poorly drained soils where they need a little bit of tillage to help get the crop going, and then they have rye in between. They'll solid seed the field to rye and then come in and build strips and plant the crop into those strips. We see no yield disadvantage, and sometimes we see a yield advantage to this system. So just in review, if you cannot spring apply all of your acres with nitrogen, consider at least applying it to your most vulnerable acres. Think about a 25% spring applied. If you're all fall applied, think about going to 25% spring applied or maybe more. Make sure your ammonia is applied deep enough to protect the 2021 crop. Try adaptive management in your corn on corn acres, and that is apply some pre-plant down early and then adjust your side dress rates according to the weather. Soil testing is very profitable. It has a high ROI. Don't neglect lime, and consider cover crops to manage nitrogen loss, but plan to manage them differently. And finally, just a little comment here, a shameless plug for our program. Work with us. We do nitrogen rate trials, tillage, nitrogen form and placement, adaptive management, variable rate soybean seeding, cover crops, and we're always interested in your ideas. You can contact us at research@iasoybeans.com. Thank you much for listening.